welcome again to an Eden on EOS board meeting or chief delegate meeting. And let me just pull up the agenda. And in attendance today, we have three board members present. Brock Pierce, I'll be chairing today's meeting. Chuck McDonald and Edgar Fernandez. Michael Sullivan is absent and proxied his vote to Chuck. Francis is here to present Gracie's update, and we've had a discussion around our rules around governance and how proxies and things work. But today's meeting will begin, and the first portion of our meetings are in giving a 2-minute update from each of the chief delegates. And so, Francis, thank you for your attendance here today. If you would begin and give us an update on all things happening with Gracie. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, so the major work Gracie's team is working on is the Chinese.Eden. So far we have made the second round of mock election to be on June 12th. So far we are doing several rounds of testing and writing the documents. Also, we are training some operators and volunteers to make sure everything's fine when the real election comes out. And the second thing is a request platform called eDAO. I'm not sure if she mentioned that before. So people can release and take requests in that platform. Right now, Gracie is trying to attract members from the community and outside of the US community, trying to add more influence on that. And the third thing is she's hosting some AMAs targeting also both EOS community and also the other public chains, other DAO organizations, to tell them what's going on EOS, like UVM, Mandel, and Blue Papers. Yeah, that's it.
Excellent. Thank you for being clear and concise and giving us that update. If you want to stay with us through the remainder of the updates, you can then give Gracie an update, which she'll get anyway. These calls are recorded. One of the things that I've added to my update is just a status of funds. And so I had received 811 EOS as a chief delegate. I've spent 195 EOS to date, and so there's that's what's been received to date, and that was spent on April. 811. Spent 195, which reduced down to 616, and I guess I'll send this in a spreadsheet, and it might be worth just us keeping that in terms of the treasurer function, is just maintaining a balance of each of the chief delegates so that we're tracking funds, both for the organization, but us individually, so that from a reporting perspective, that's in place. Feel from a best practices perspective, that's probably a good idea. And so the current balance, because there was another 770 received, I'm sitting at 1,387 EOS. The funds spent to date were given in the Pomelo Season 2. I had donated 195 EOS in the Pomelo Season 2 in my role as a chief delegate. And I'll send out an update so that we have that in more details. I'm currently working with my team on a proposal. One of the biggest things that I think is lacking in EOS is that we're not showing up at the events around the world. There's crypto gatherings all over the world and conferences happening constantly. And there is very little in the way of EOS representation, at these events. And so identifying a list of call it potential speakers, people that are able to represent and present EOS and all of the activity happening, and knowing that there's, call it that speakers bureau, basically a list of people that can represent us. and organizing all of the events around the world, and working on a proposal for the ENF for sponsorship and funding so that we can have a presence in all of these things. And my original commitment in becoming a chief delegate was to work with other groups. And so I'm working with the EOS bees and allowing bee hives to potentially set up at conferences. Think of that as the booth. And the hive would be a booth at these events with the bees tending to the hive so that we have a presence in crypto conferences around the world, as well as having, people that are able to be, headline speakers at those events. Because if a tree falls in the forest and no one hears it, and that's kind of what's going on with EOS. There's been, incredible developments, tremendous progress, but we're really only speaking to ourselves. The EOS community is talking to the EOS community and not really effectively communicating to the rest of the, call it, cryptocurrency community. And I think a presence at those events is something that is now necessary. We've generally been forgotten about, and we have to get outside of our own community to show the rest of the broader ecosystem the tremendous progress that's been made. Chuck?
Yeah, over the last 2 weeks, I guess, I've been meeting regularly with a committee of Eden members. If I can get the name right, I I believe it's Advancing Eden Engagement. So we're going to be meeting every Wednesday going forward now. Like we've been meeting every Wednesday at 9 a.m. Eastern time, but we're going to be starting a weekly event, much like as Fractally is doing on their Saturday calls. So Eden members are invited to just attend. You'll be getting an NFT for just attending. And then you'll also be getting NFTs based on your ranking in your contribution to Eden for that week. So it's an effort to increase engagement, increase member activities, and reward engagement. So on top of that, we're also working on an NFT engine, essentially, for Eden. One of my goals is to be able to allow Eden members to create whitelists to distribute NFTs basically for whatever purpose they desire. That could be an open source tool that anybody in Eden could conceivably use also. In EOS, and it would just make it simple so that any organization would be able to appoint a leader or a representative in their organization to take care of distributing NFTs on behalf of that organization. So one of my immediate goals is to create collect.eden. Right now, the only account that we're using in Eden is Genesis.Eden, and that contains our treasury. And I believe all of the NFTs that we got from account creation were generated under Genesis.Eden. So the top level domain Eden name is not in our possession, as it's owned by Eden members, and it would be really, really great if we could create accounts off of .eden. So on top of that, we also need permissions for the active keys for Genesis.Eden, which is another thing to talk about. But anyway, going forward in the next week, we will be having that first event next Wednesday, and every Eden member is invited, and it should be, hopefully we should get a good turnout and distribute some NFTs and distribute some EOS. There is some EOS in the pot. I'm going to be contributing from my budget towards that. and other Eden members who have been fundraising for this purpose will also be contributing towards that. So I'm done.
Thank you, Chuck. Edgar?
Yeah, well, we've been continuing to work on the Eden Delegate Accounting Standard. I'm going to share my screen real quick. This past week and a half, really, we have worked on setting up the project board and the different tasks. So we have done that and selected a product backlog of different tasks that we need to get done. The high fidelity wireframes that I already shared with the community are up for everybody to review. We're really looking to receive some feedback from more delegates and more of the community. So we'll try and contact some directly on that this upcoming week. But really just a call to all Eden members to provide some feedback on this accounting standard. We think it could be very, very useful, not only for Eden, but for other organizations that want to use the Eden process. One of the feedbacks that we received from delegates was the ability to classify their expenses after they've been sent. So at first we just thought, you could claim and then classify that expense. But if you had claimed already and wanted to go back and classify, so we're adding that in based on feedback on the project. We've also hired 5 developers since the last Eden election, 2 of which junior developers will be focused on Eden. So focused on this Eden accounting standard and getting very familiar with the members table. So we're excited about that. It's part of our plan to train, to hire, and to build and have, Eden has its own projects. Eden has its own goals, and being able to tap into developers that have been trained and funded by Eden at the beginning of their career, I think is a good strategy. So that is what we've been working on. Please check out this Kanban board under Eden Accounting Standard. This is the same thing that I put in the forum. You could see all the code and what we're trying to build right on GitHub. Again, this would be transferred over to the Eden GitHub when appropriate, when ready. But that's what me and our team has been focused on since the beginning. That's what we ran on. And then later on, Chuck, we can check out the permissions you're talking about here. I've got it pulled up just because I do see that we do have some active multi-sig permissions based on our Eden accounts. So we can kind of discuss that if we have time later on in the agenda. But that's our update. Thank you very much, Brock. Let me stop sharing my screen here. There you go.
Well, thank you for the updates. Francis, that's the update portion of the meeting. We hope Gracie as well. Thank you so much for your attendance. Perfect. All right, I think that was handled correctly. I guess the next part of our agenda was the Eden Member Services discussion. And yeah, we've allocated more than enough time to cover. Probably we've allocated more time than we probably need. So, but that's the topic for this portion of our meeting.
Yeah, I think that was proposed by Michael to provide sort of this Eden core, right? The member services that focuses on different circles. We ratified to approve that and to support that. One of the thoughts that came out of that discussion was, the need for Eden to have a legal entity to hold some of these, social media accounts or some assets that you might want to assign to people. And I followed the discussion in one of the Telegram channels around that, and I thought, I forget who suggested it, but I thought it was a good idea that you kind of push that to the edges, to the members itself, and where Eden, as it's the chief delegates and the board, doesn't necessarily, interact and create a legally recognized DAO in a certain jurisdiction, but rather these member services in these circles can then, if they need, if we want, Eden Network Publishing or Communications or something, and that could be, Michael's thing, and he registers an entity, and the Eden chief delegates then say, look, we're hiring, this entity to now be custody of our social media, and they have a certain mandate for a certain amount of time, and we're paying them a certain amount. We're kind of pushing the legal friction, kind of the interaction with, I want to say the real world, but at least the legal recognized jurisdictions. That way, each of those member services, whether that's communications, public relations, development, community engagement, really they're free to set up as many legal entities they want and become vendors to Eden or provide services to Eden, and that might be a good and sophisticated, elegant solution where Eden itself doesn't necessarily become a legal entity, and Chuck, Edgar, and Brock appear as board of directors on this entity registered in Wyoming, for example, but rather we keep this as ephemeral as possible, and the member services then, those circles themselves and the people leading those circles can then choose whether it makes sense for them to create these legal entities, that then can sign contracts or receive funds, custody, social media accounts, etc. But I thought that was sort of a good solution where we don't necessarily create a legal DAO for Eden on EOS, but we do allow our member services to kind of incorporate if that helps them reach their goals and their tasks.
Yeah. So in nonprofits, there's a framework that may be applicable here that's pretty standard, which is what's known as fiscal sponsorship. So if you're setting up a new charity, charities are highly regulated, and there's a process and approvals and things of that nature. So normally, if you're setting up a new nonprofit, you partner with a fiscal sponsor. The fiscal sponsor is the legal entity that does all the signing and handles all the compliance and all that sort of stuff. That model or framework might be applicable. The fiscal sponsor doesn't make decisions, but the fiscal sponsor is there to facilitate the nonprofit activity on behalf of the new organization that may be young or subscale to have all of its own infrastructure. And so that kind of legal framework might make sense, where we have a fiscal, call it a legal sponsor, which is that organization that is facilitating those activities for whatever time. They don't have the authority to make decisions. They take their direction from, call it this board, this body, this group of chief delegates. But then there's a legal entity that then acts on behalf of the direction from us. That sort of model, is also one worth contemplating. Chuck, you sent something around here.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just came across this paper yesterday, and I haven't actually read it all. But it's we can add it in the show notes, I'm sure. It is written by a professor of law, Chris Brummer from Georgetown Institute of International Economic Law. And I'll just read the abstract really quick. I invite everybody to read it. I'm most of the way through it, and it's fantastic, and it's very relevant to DAOs. So it's about legal wrappers and DAOs. This white paper offers the first comprehensive overview and explanation of legal wrappers available to DAOs. It observes how the qualitative features of DAOs, including their dispersed and fluid memberships and blockchain-based governance, are unanticipated by legal wrappers modeled after 20th century corporations, not-for-profits, and partnerships. It then surveys a diverse range of wrappers available to DAOs and highlights how thoughtful legal engineering can help mitigate frictions that arise when attempting to wrap established legal forms around DAOs and DAO operations. To demonstrate, the white paper proceeds through a variety of fact scenarios spanning protocol, media, collector, social, and philanthropic DAOs to illustrate how wrappers might be employed to protect DAO participants from unlimited liability, optimize tax treatment, engage in contractual off-chain transactions, and enable compliance with key regulatory expectations. So I posted the link there, and I invite everybody to read that. It's as I say, I'm not all the way through it, but it's fantastically written and very relevant to what we're doing.
Thanks for the share, Chuck. I mean, I know it seems like it was just published May 30th. So extremely recent. I can understand why you haven't finished it. It was just published. It's still hot off the press. I think that's super relevant. I'm gonna take some time to do that, and even in that abstract, it mentions a little bit of what Brock just talked about, right? Legal rappels modeled after corporations, nonprofits, and partnerships. So definitely relevant. And Brock, I think your experience around foundations and non-for-profits, what works well and what we shouldn't take, right? What doesn't work well. And apply that to DAOs. One of I'm glad you brought that up too, because one of the things that I think, the reason to be for Eden, right, as a process, really it's a way to have blockchain-based oversight and blockchain-based rules for a common treasury. And how many, boards do that, provide oversight, and how many boards also provide oversight over funds, right, over a communal fund. And that is also an application that's a real world application, right? I would love to see boards that are selected using the Eden process, or non-for-profits that's their governance body is selected using the Eden process, right? Where how they actually elect board members and then distribute funds allocated to them. So I think it's a great opportunity. Chuck, you've mentioned it before, kind of Eden for charities, Eden for nonprofits. So if we get it right for us and our organization and our common goal here, it may be replicable to other entities that we already sit on. Like we already sit on boards, and we can bring it in and say, hey, this is how we can maybe do a mock election of what the next board would look like. Or if we are on a not-for-profit or want to start one, this is a way that we can select the governing body.
Yeah, there's a couple of other questions I'd love to understand. Because there's no legal entity, if anything were to happen, where someone had a claim against us as the governing body or board, I imagine that we have no legal protection. Meaning, if someone wanted to sue,
Director's insurance.
Yeah, basically, I assume that we have no shields. If this as a group did anything wrong, we could all be probably sued individually in whatever jurisdiction we're in. I'd love to not in this call, but geek out on those sorts of things. And then, what does that look like in terms of directors and officers, sort of D&O policies? Is that something that could conceivably be held by that fiscal sponsor? I have a lot of experience in all this sort of stuff. And so there's all sorts of interesting questions that are not going to come up for us, but they're going to be things that come up in the future.
Yeah. Just on that topic, if you look at the structure of our account system, our Genesis.Eden account is not the essence of Eden, but it's our treasury, right? And our treasury currently is from one benefactor, which is the EOS network itself. So our treasury account, the owner permissions are the block producers. So the EOS network essentially owns Eden's treasury right now, but it's not Eden's whole treasury, because Eden could easily create another account which could be funded from another benefactor or another source, right? So it's interesting when you think about it, like the block producers don't own Eden, they own the account that they contributed to, right? And if we were acting on their behalf on the capacity of working towards EOS's objectives, which we are, they sort of they don't have governance control over us, but like what you were saying, they are they sort of spawned the organization with the initial gift or sponsorship or whatever you want to call it. But do they have liability for what we do? Does the network itself have liability because the network is the owner of the Eden treasury right now? And it's just so much to talk about. And anyway, go ahead.
Well, I think we can probably wrap up this topic, since this is a topic that Michael Sullivan had added to the agenda, since we'll probably add another 5 to 10 minutes, I suspect, into the next Eden chief delegate call to make sure that this topic is and a good moment to transition to the next topic on our agenda, which is what you mentioned, the Genesis.Eden account keys. My understanding is, have we made a formal request for those keys to be transferred? And we probably in that want to make sure that we have a document, a one-pager of how those keys would be held by the Eden delegates and how those keys would be transferred to subsequent delegates. I imagine with a 5-person board, what should happen is after each election, we transfer our keys, to the next 5 chief delegates, right? Each chief delegate, one of the things of being a chief delegate, I would think, is you're one of the key holders of the multi-sig, right? You've been duly elected by the community through a democratic process. And that's, but we need to formalize that into a document, I would think, a simple document that says what the sort of standard operating procedures are. And once we've got that documented, I think that we should share that with Fractally to have the Eden on EOS, chief delegates take over the governance of the Genesis keys. Does that sound right?
It does. And that document is essentially the bylaws that we just ratified. There it says the new board will assume the active permissions. I'm trying to find the exact verbiage, but that's what it says.
So my understanding is we have not requested the keys. So we need to formally make that request.
We had a motion. We did actually request them also.
We did, but has someone communicated to Fractally? Have we had that conversation? Someone needs to take on that role, which I think was Michael Sullivan, right? Michael is, I think, taken on that responsibility. Is that correct?
I believe he said he was going to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, I took the liberty here to share the active keys. So this is the Genesis.Eden account, right? These are the active keys, doing it right. Mike Manfredi, Sparks, Todd B. Fleming, which we can look up, who each account is in the Eden members UI, right? And then subsequent to that are the board major keys, which are, I assume, automatically assigned after an election, right? Because each of us have a Eden account associated. So that's why we have, this is my account, Gracie's, Chuck's, Brock's, and Michael's already assigned below those active keys. And then not sure why we have a minor here, but same keys are assigned. So just to confirm, what we're looking for is this at this hierarchy. These are the keys that we want, or the multi-sig here of these active keys.
I believe so. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, the chief delegates are the elected. We're the elected, empowered folks. And that will be changing, and that's something that's going to be part of the code,
right?
As part of the bylaws, and it should change automatically. I don't know if the previous board would have to sign an MSIG to release those keys or whatever.
I just sent you the active account keys. There's a link in the chat.
And that's for the Eden top level domain, essentially.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, since we're talking about all of it, figured, let's.
Yeah, it seems to be this kind of the same accounts, right, that we just reviewed. But yeah, so and then to just kind of recap here, we are looking for those keys, Chuck, because you also want to generate NFTs from that account from Genesis.Eden. And correct me if I'm wrong. I'm just sort of kind of recapping here in my head, as well as in order to change some of the Eden OS code, we need access to those keys, like the funding motion, the change in the funding schedule. Is that correct? Yep. Any other item or action item that we identified that requires those keys, just so we can make that very clear? Again, if we were to formally request through Michael or through anyone else, that's the reasoning that we're giving, right? Just to be clear.
Well, there's the two things, right? There's 180,000 EOS, right? That's connected to those keys, right? The treasury.
Yeah.
Yep. Genesis.Eden. And there's the top level domain. So there's the formal request for that, sort of key transfer to occur. And I do recommend that we create a sort of standard operating procedure document that's not in the bylaws, but the handoff, when we're leaving as chief delegates to the next chief delegates, which is here's your checklist. This is welcome to being a chief delegate. These are, the things that you have to do as your first order of business that don't necessarily go into the bylaws, but as here's your tutorial. Welcome to your new appointed role. These are the things that, the first things that, all the boxes that you need to check.
And one of those would be an MSIG to relinquish your permissions.
Yeah. And so we should make the job of the next delegates all that much easier, right? Our job is to leave it better than we found it. We're having to let's just say we had no onboarding. We were elected and we just showed up and it's like, hey guys, okay. Let's try to make this a little easier for the next group in terms of continuity, knowledge transfer, key transfer, all of the things, so that they're basically their first week in office is call it transition, right? We've been in what I'd call a long transition.
Yep. So that should be that dovetailing, that handshake after each election should be the previous board signing an MSIG to relinquish the permissions and the new board signing an MSIG to accept those permissions.
Yeah, what I say is, so you have an election, right? The election happens, and then between the election, the inauguration, right? Basically, our inauguration should be the key signing ceremony. And I would recommend we create a key signing ceremony.
You're literally taking the words out of my mouth, right? Yeah, it's a transfer of power. It's a huge ceremony. It's a celebration of this process. It's the most important thing, and it's definitely a ceremony, right? And every country does it. It's a transition, the peaceful transition of power. So, Brock, literally taking the words out of my mouth. Continue, because I think that would be a very cool event.
Yeah. So after the election, the next thing that we need to now add and schedule as we build upon that which we know and into this organization is the election, and then the inauguration, which is the key signing ceremony, which is the current chief delegates, ourselves, going through that peaceful transition of power, which should be the transfer of the keys. And I would recommend that we should have a key signing ceremony, as part of. We're having this one a little late. We've assumed the role without the actual keys. So let's invite the past chief delegates and let's actually have our first sort of beta test of, formalizing this process. So with all future elections, this is normalized, and it should be a celebration. And we can have it as a public Zoom, where we can send out that invite all of the Eden members to show up if they wish. And in the same way that we had an election process, we should have an inauguration key transfer ceremony. I'd recommend that we try to get that done. I'd recommend June 15th, because it's June 2nd. That's the original signing of the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta being the birthplace of decentralization. So we could have our first key signing ceremony on June 15th. That gives us almost 2 weeks to organize and schedule everybody.
Yeah.
And it seems like a good inaugural date to have the first inauguration, signing ceremony, to go into the written record of all that we've done here. It just seems like a good, anniversary date, and we can have a June 15th celebration every year that may not be the key signing ceremony, but an important date in the context of Eden on EOS.
Yeah, well, this year it coincides perfectly with our planned Wednesday Eden events. We're going to have a whole bunch of Eden members on the call anyway, doing a Eden election style event. And if we schedule it for that, everybody's invited. We'll have a big party and we'll sign an MSIG.
Yeah, I like it. I mean, one point of clarification though, in this particular case, the active keys aren't coming from the past chief delegates, right?
They're coming from Eden members.
They're coming from Eden members, but not the first elected chief delegates. It's not, Aaron Cox and Randall and Chris who are passing it along. It's, Mike and Todd and the other development team. Just point of clarification, right?
Yeah.
Correct. Thank you.
But going forward, it will be the chief delegates passing the law.
Yeah.
Correct. I have a tendency of speaking from the future. It's a technique that we use formally. I'm actually here as part of a 2030 group. What we do is we design the future and then we work our way, and then we work backwards. Yeah. So the future, we're talking about what world are we going to live in the year 2030, and then we describe the future. We talk about what we did, and then we go through the process of explaining how we did it in the context of it being done and having happened from the future. And this is one of the techniques we use. We future cast instead of forecast. Mm-hmm. And so there we go. That gives, I think, us enough time to try and organize everything. And that's great. Is there anything else that we want to cover in the context of the Genesis.Eden accounts?
I would just add, last comment is, this is extra motivation for whether that's a Fractally team or any other team to sort of, again, re-engage, right? Instead of just us kind of knocking on the door, it's like it's a whole ceremony that you're invited to, and there's sort of more of a formality around it. And hopefully that serves as a kind of re-engagement to not only past members, current members, and future members. So I love the idea.
And it coincides with re-engagement from the Eden side also, because we're basically with these Wednesday calls going forward, we're going to be adopting essentially the work that Fractally has been doing. So moving into small meetings, recurring weekly meetings where we encourage each other. There's camaraderie, there's friendships being built. And that's something that we've really seen as a product of the Fractally process. So we're looking to re-engage Eden members who might have fallen away or been isolated from that, and we're looking to incorporate every bit of quality open source work out there from the Fractally team, and we invite them to reignite their interest in Eden also, and we're going to work together on this whole thing.
Great. So on that same note, I think this also transitions well, which is the Eden on EOS Twitter account, and call it other critical access points, and I think we have to make a decision. Are we happy with the ad hoc understanding that we don't have access to our own Twitter account? And are we comfortable with that? How are we making that request of that transfer of the sort of social accounts if we wish for them to be transferred? And to the extent that we can't get them transferred, do we create new accounts? And just wanted to bring up that as one of the topics of discussion. I think that it may be best to postpone that as well until Michael Sullivan is here, since he's been taking the lead on that. But if there's anything we want to add now I think that should probably be left as a short discussion item for the next board meeting as well.
To clarify, it's not that we don't have access to posting. Like we've been offered the posting permissions basically for it, like the ability to post using it, but we don't have ownership of it. That's the point of clarity there. And I think in a lot of Eden members' eyes, it was the prudent thing to do when Eden was just starting out, to not like for individual members to start initiatives up and then hold on to ownership of them. There's an interesting idea of whether if somebody's going to be holding organizational assets, in their own name, which could be fine. And if they're going to invite the organization to use those assets, such as our domains or our Twitter, or the Twitter, whatever you want to call it, maybe those people who hold those assets and hold basically the owner permissions of them, essentially the logins for those Twitter accounts or YouTube accounts or whatever, maybe they should post a bond that Eden would hold. And if they, if they refused permissions in the future or something, or if something went south, that bond might be the mediator of.
Well, but this goes back to member services.
Yeah.
We could, all we need in the case of the account holder is an agreement in place that says I am holding this account on behalf of the Eden DAO or Eden on EOS, and I'm just a steward or custodial holder of this asset, but to make sure that it's clearly stated, who owns the asset, right? You may be the owner in terms of holding the account, but the ultimate beneficial owner is meant to be the DAO, right? Yeah. And how we get all this stuff organized for the next round of chief delegates, right? We spent I'd say a tremendous amount of our time, a majority of our time, centered on housekeeping.
Yeah. Yep.
Is just kind of throwing an idea here, is there a more elegant, like, technical solution to this where I have to think about this more, but where the multi-sig itself, controls the password to those accounts or something like that, or the password is saved and can only be decrypted with a multi-sig, something like that, where we're trying to,
Well, the key is ultimately in the password recovery. The key is ultimately in not
the
access
email
to the password. The password can be changed. The ultimate, key is the associated email. And the owner of that email.
Right. We'd need email that's controlled by a multi-sig, in a sense.
Does anyone provide an email, a blockchain-based sort of email service?
They try. I think there was something called Dmail that was trying to do something like that, an inbox that's controlled by blockchain keys. But I don't know of one that's operational now. What I do know is, Web3 domains that you can send payments. You can also have a website, and you might have an email associated to a Web3 domain. But not sure if it's just an email solution, but something to look into for sure. And if there's any Eden members that know about this or want to build it, obviously there's a use case.
Yeah.
And do we have a document anywhere with what I normally all of our assets and all of our collateral and logos and kind of all of that that repository of sort of call it our filing cabinet or our data room, and how do we organize all that information so that and how do we want that to be organized?
Yeah.
Well, the way we've always done it is through our same GitHub repository, right? That's where we have our brand assets. That's where we have, any visual design, and any code, right? And GitHub is pretty powerful at doing that. So I think that's way more, makes more sense to me than having some sort of like a Google Drive or something like that. I mean, we already have our code in a GitHub. You can already do project boards and save visual design and documents there. That's what I would suggest, that the Eden GitHub repository is that data room that Brock is alluding to. Again, which begs the question, who has the keys or the access to that Eden repository?
Owned by Microsoft.
Someone needs to, take on the responsibility of, again, organizing all of the assets, documenting all of those assets. GitHub is a fine place to keep it all of that access points. But another thing on our list of housekeeping.
Yeah.
Would be definitely, I think it's important and our responsibility to make sure that the next chief delegates are not devoting so much time to this type of work.
Well, I just included the GitHub repo that's connected to at least the Genesis.Eden.eoscommunity.org link, and it is under gofractally/Eden. It's a public repo, but we would have to reach out to see who are there's plenty of contributors there. Todd Fleming, Brandon, a lot of the members from John Williamson of the last team and the Fractally team generally. But that's the repo. That's where it lives, and that's where I suggest keeping the data room.
So we essentially just be copying that, right? Forking that. Is that what you're recommending, Edgar?
Well, I don't know about forking it. I being added as owners, right? The other solution would be forking that into just a new repo away from the Fractally repo. But again, that's a discussion to have, right? I believe that it was probably standalone and it was brought in under a Fractally at some point, but I'm not positive on that.
I believe that was renamed from Clarion.
Right. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, that's right. That's correct. So that's where the code sits. The way we've handled design assets and branding and logos, fonts has been to include them in our repo along with different brand assets, which then makes it very simple for press or anyone to select your brand book if they want to use it. A media kit, if you will.
Yeah, we should. Another thing for Michael Sullivan would be an electronic press kit, media kit, EPK, a lot of stuff that we can try and do here. And Michael's
there's a lot of people looking for more information on a clarified mission statement. Our mission statement right now is to provide value to the EOS ecosystem, right? And our membership are asking for more clarity on that. Like, what does that mean? What's the act? If you could flesh out that mission statement, what would it be? Or a methodology statement or something like that. Something simple that we can all agree on. As our public face, what is Eden? Well, it's this, and it's this in one sentence, and then it's this in a one page, that kind of thing is something that should be going along with our assets.
Yeah, I would be open to allocating part of the my chief delegate resources to Michael Sullivan and any of the people on his team to help put together some of that collateral. I'd be happy to and talk to the Helios team. But getting a bunch of this sort of stuff in place to set Eden on EOS up for future success, I think is very important work. So we're out of time and we've gotten through the entire agenda. I guess the next meeting I don't know when that meeting would be scheduled for. We're normally meeting on Thursdays. We're a little off schedule in terms of we missed a week due to multiple attempts to reschedule. It's just we couldn't get everyone together, so that was just a matter of. I think we tried to do the meeting 5 times this week, and out of respect for everybody's calendars, time, personal situations, we ended up not. We ended up being delayed. It's been 2 weeks since our last meeting. So we're definitely scheduled for next Thursday, and I guess Chuck, you're supposed to chair the next meeting. Is that correct?
That's the order of, maybe we should talk about averaging in another meeting, over the next 4 weeks or something, like if
I think what we do is, since rather than trying to play catch up, we should probably schedule a special meeting.
Yeah.
With a different format. Maybe since we picked up an extra meeting, which we should have anyway, we may want to have that meeting 4 weeks before the end of our tenure, which is not for our regularly scheduled, but basically a recap meeting to go through everything that happened through our first 8 weeks, and to set the agenda for our final month. And we may want to have a special meeting dedicated to just that. It's basically recap of the first 2 months. What is it that we're trying to get done in our last month? And I think scheduling a special meeting, which Edgar, maybe you want to chair, since you are the randomly selected Satoshi head chief. That might be a good meeting for you to chair. Call it special meeting.
We also have to really buckle down and dial in on bylaws, right? We have a time limit of 2 weeks.
I'd say that's probably one of the main purposes of that meeting. Yeah.
Yeah. So we need to send out the invitation to our members to start contributing formally. So, the way that the previous CDs did it was they had an open Google document that anybody could come and edit and contribute to. So we need to put out the invitation for new bylaw ideas, and we need to start writing them up formally so that we can vote on them before the deadline.
Yeah, so I agree. And I mentioned this before. I think the past notes, a lot of what we've discussed, it was, okay, this should be in the bylaws, or this should be proposed. We've kind of been building it as we go. So I'm not too worried about at least that first draft. And I agree, we have to get feedback from the community. But so we are scheduled for next Thursday. Chuck, you'll be meeting that. We want to do that key signing ceremony by the 15th. So do we want to schedule that extraordinary now, or do we want to wait? Because we could do it, we could do, a double meeting week, the week of the 20th June. Maybe one Tuesday and then the other one on Thursday. But I'd like to have, Gracie and Michael here to coordinate again, so we're not doing that.
Yeah, I think let's not try to schedule these things without their presence.
Yeah.
Let's just know that this is urgent to get these things locked in. It can be done offline. All right.
Fantastic.
Well, if there's nothing else to add, meeting adjourned. It's good to see you both. I'm still in Spain, and hopefully leaving tomorrow.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to stop the recording, and appreciate Brock, you're chairing the meeting today.
Thanks, Brock. Thanks, Edgar.
Thank you.